Thank you first to Kyle, Laura, Nicole, and Anna at the Poetry Project for supporting and facilitating this virtual launch of Joan Retallack BOSCH'D, aptly released on April Fool's Day of this year, 2020. I'm Tracy Grinnell, author most recently of Hell Figures from Nightboat Books, and I'm the founding editor and director of Litmus Press. I'm recording from Brooklyn today. I'm going to read some very brief introductions of our extraordinary group of readers, for our extraordinary group of readers. Forrest Gander, calling in from Petaluma, California, is author most recently of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book of poetry, Be With. His book, Twice Alive, is forthcoming from New Directions next year, and I believe that's the work we'll hear from today. His current affiliation is with the California Landscape. Mónica de la Torre is the author most recently of Repetition 19, also from Nightboat Books. She teaches at Brooklyn College and is recording from Queens today. And Fred Moten is the author, again, most recently, of All That Beauty from Letter Machine Editions. He's professor in NYU's Department of Performance Studies and is joining us from Manhattan. And Joan Retallack is the author of the Symposium, Procedural Elegies, Western Civ Continued, and The Poethical Wager. Retallack is a poet and essayist with an early background in philosophy and visual art. Her poetic practice investigates, at times procedurally enacts, intersections of poetics and socio-political puzzles. Retallack is joining us today from upstate New York. In 2018, Litmus Press published the Symposium, Thought Experiments and Poethical Play in Difficult Times, edited by Retallack as documentation and continuation of a MoMA event she organized in collaboration with Black Dada artist Adam Pendleton. And I just want to note both Fred Moten and Mónica de la Torre contributed to the symposium, so I'm really grateful to have you both participating in this launch as well. Following the publication of the symposium, we are honored to present Joan Retallack BOSCH'D, a book of fables, moral tales, and other awkward constructions that extend the author's playful and grave poetics of the poethical wager. BOSCH'D is passionate, transgressive, and, albeit obliquely, optimistic that we can, but only with creative buoyancy, exhume a sense of viable futures for all species on this planet. To quote Retallack from the Poethical Wager, every boundary construction is a gamble, a dare, a hypothetical with consequences. And from None Too Soon in BOSCH'D, the only worthwhile thought experiment of which I'm currently aware is to construct a logical space-time bracket in which all of us, animal, mineral, vegetable, are sometimes dreaming. The wagers and labors of the poetical life, the prolific praxis of perpetual poesis. In its exploration of form, procedure, composition, poetry proposes alternate timescales, alternate visions, life that exceeds the grief of life to imagine what comes next. The future creates the past. The best poetry invites and incites alterity, a swerve of attention, invites and incites us to stay in motion. I am grateful for the examples that these three poets here provide. Thank you, and am thrilled to introduce Joan Retallack.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks so much to the Poetry Project, and of course to these wonderful people who are doing this with me today. BOSCH'D starts out as an homage to the late 15th, early 16th century painter who created, among other things, a garden of earthly delights where no color line is drawn. You have seen an example of that on the screen, I think, already. And in the book cover's detail. But BOSCH'D is also structured as a kind of secular liturgy dedicated to the improbable idea of a poethical anthropocene. That inspiration for me means loving the improbable in recognition that nature is not the opposite of culture, but is the entanglement of all things. And that's where poetry's many improbable logics come in. I'm going to read from a number of sections of the book, BOSCH'D. And I just want to let you know in advance that the sections are actually divided into quasi-liturgical, or divided by quasi-liturgical headings that are in Latin freely translated. So I will tell you what the heading is for each of the poems that I'm going to be reading. Starting with in loco, or on the spot, and beginning with a poem called The Ventriloquist's Dilemma. Birdsong entered our words and left with migratory echoes insufficiently dispersed. We are not designed to perceive most of what surrounds us or to fully understand the rest. Maybe it's true nonlinear equations drove the teenager off the road. The self-propagating slope remains unhindered in its XY axis. It's always difficult to state these things rigorously. Sound waves break on the shore, making some feel unwelcome. And there's that conspicuous absence of real metaphor in nature. Sorry, I think I meant to say there's that conspicuous absence of real nature in metaphor. Someone will claim real is a misleading construct. Someone will claim night flew into a tree. Those 5 words in a line. Fierce love story. To start with a taxonomic impediment and yet go on, looking always for news of another kind. Great saturated patches of color stall in their rumble toward the horizon. Squeeze tube dearth overflows with biblical pornography. No greater love, they had said. Sit back and watch in awe as one sophisticated critter eviscerates another on a color-coded screen. Much too bright or not enough to be convincing descriptions of nature. For the disillusioned, there are these 3 things. 1, sonorous cowboys hitch up primate dungarees. 2, to restore the consolation of silence will remain the role of objects. 3, 4 little girls, along with fragile creatures of other kinds, will wander in and out of this color field just beyond our grasp. The next section that I'm going to be reading from is In Loco Scientia, or Math and Psi. And I'll start with the magic rule of 9. Your sonic suit will never be a perfect fit. You'll learn to get by. Just don't assume all art is all about victory over death all the time. Not to say the meantime isn't as good a time as any to enjoy not being dead. In the swell of many a meantime, many have diverted themselves with great success. Hence civilization's discontents and greatest hits. Take, for instance, the magic rule of 9, that the sums of all numbers within the sums of all multiplicands of 9 up to and including 9 equal 9. 1 times 9 equals 9. 9 equals 9. 2 times 9 equals 18. 1 plus 8 equals 9. 3 times 9 equals 27. 2 plus 7 equals 9, etc. This is numerically melodious. Bird sings in tree. To the species that longs for more than a first glance affords. Someone will say, if you really think this is magic, you don't properly understand the decimal system. Bird falls out of tree. Who among us doesn't long for magic? Who among us truly understands the decimal system? The next section that I'm going to read from is in loco tempus, or the nick of time, beginning with a question of time. No, I'm sorry. I'm not going to begin with a question of time. It's the other side, that's the wrong side of the page that I'm going to be reading from. Real-time experiment, war games. The experiment is set ticking in blatant display of its own QED. Just like the homemade bomb, it may or may not be. We freaks of nature spawned too many mirror image echoes, more diversion tactics than our holdover species could responsibly deploy. Meanwhile, it's all that's left. Meanwhile is all that's left in the violence of precision-timed untimelies. Any self-respecting PlayStation terrorist will have honed the outcome to this pretty T. No problem. Authorities on it 24/7 and then some. Real-time simulations up and running for years spew enough data to settle one matter after another in nick after nick of real time. So many nicks, so much real time, blood everywhere. Happy days, victory is ours. Moral. After victory in war lies mortally injured peace, the hard-won puzzle, the valiant paradox, the name of the game. And the little world of finite time. You gotta make yourself clear. I try to, but I never got the chance. Raymond Queneau. As usual in the banlieue, the ghettos, the hoods, the favelas, everything happens at once. Hair-triggered drive-by emotions spatter probable opinion with improbable hope in probable margins of error. Try not to get distracted in the few minutes we have left. A sudden realization could occur. Beware of sudden realizations. The Book of Job diagnostician is in juvie detention for life. Don't worry, make no mistake about it. You still have all the time in the world that is the only one you'll ever know. Time enough to celebrate another scratch and win money back guarantee that everyone will get a chance. Coda. Regal chance strode proud along the parapet of own sweet time. Sun ravished innocent horizon. Horizon vanished every point sun had ever made. So the next section is in loco malum et alteritas, or evil and others. That's a very long section in this book, but I'm only going to read 2 pieces from it. Beginning with a puzzling interlude, Projectile Legacies, that starts with an epigraph from a young teenage student in Inkster, Mississippi, who was part of something called the racecardproject.com, hosted by Wayne State University. And this is Nicole D. Riggs. Will they ever stop fearing us? How to think about future contingent possibilities of indigenous peoples caught in past perfected, present participling legacies of genocide and appropriation. How to think about future contingent possibilities of African Americans caught in past perfected, present participling legacies of white supremacy and slavery. How to think about future contingent possibilities of Palestinians caught in past perfected, present participling legacies of Nakba and occupation. Oppressors fear most those whom they oppress to the point of terror. Love and hate. As love and hate are equally understood to be heat-seeking devices, we can continue to count on competitive sages, self-promoting public intellectuals, fame-hungry literati, mega-church evangelists, fatuous politicians, unreliable narrators of the blockbusters' histories of all time, from Herodotus on, to leave those parts out. Molière noticed how hypocrisy tends to be a fashionable vice, how fashionable vices tend to become the most fashionable virtues. Coda, bleak rectangular acoustics, wide-angled similes and smiles, irreversibly tangled thoughts of tangled bodies in oddly flattering mirrors. This section, Evil and Others, has a subsection, has a couple of subsections, one of which is Misogyny Variations. And I'm going to read one piece from that, which is called The History of Being She. This whole section was the product of my doing a lot of research on the etymology of various gendered words, starting with she and he. And I discovered that the oldest spellings, at least the oldest spellings that the OED and the Middle English Dictionary have of she and he, are really marvelous. She is spelled S-C-H-E, which means every time I say or hear the word now, I can just hear that slicing C in it. And he is spelled H-E-E, he. So there are various poems that involve she or he and she, and there will also be a section on reinventions of gender. But this is the history of being she with the keyword iridescence. The tansy beetle, almost extinct, lives only in tansy plants. Victorians loved their iridescent wings for decorating women's garments. Rustling about in the dawn of one civilization after another, uncanny in the near visibility she shares with other iridescent creatures, butterflies, blowflies, moths, beetles, wasps. She learns how she must scintillate the darkest shadows beyond her own terror with one sweet ephemeral after another. Her world was made for this before charm turned to strangeness in one sodden domestic drama after another. And festering glamour reeked of sodden ecstasy as insect choruses murmuring stealth logics sing in praise of the many exotic species of she. Glamorous, opalescent, nacreous, shimmering, luminescent, glittering, sparkling, shining, gleaming, effulgent, lustrous, glowing, glistering, beguiling, enchanting. She was she, so sweetly she, so silently she, seductively sweet, enchanting she, nacreous she, shimmering she, so softly beguiling, softly demurring, seductively silent, silently sweet, glistering, weeping, still unyielding, softly demurring, lustrous, effulgent, silently cursing, silently screaming, silently yielding, moaning, bestowing, sweetly bleeding, luminescently swelling, birthing, suckling, silently mourning, sorrowfully keening in swaying treetops, softly crooning in kitchens with mops, she, opalescent she, inconsolable she. I just want to say about that when I think about feminist questions and the long history of misogyny that goes back beyond the beginning of recorded history, I also think about the present, but not just the present in this country, the United States, the present all over the globe, where young girls, prepubescent or barely just post-pubescent, are being made to bear children, either through rape or through its equivalent, but as child brides. And I worry that we feminists don't think enough about that larger picture of what is happening to females very young and older all over this planet. I also think that the rape of our environment, what we think of as the damage that's done by the Anthropocene, our presence having so much effect, has a lot to do with the treatment of women, that the two are very much associated, the uses of earth and the uses of women. But then there's the history of being he, H-E-E. Keyword, marching. Marching, walking in military manner with regular measured tread. 3 companies of soldiers marching around the field. The darkly radiant enigma of others, women, brazen strangers, drives the restlessness. Daily, a bit before dawn, women shuttered in houses, the men march out, vigorous, purposeful, glancing fiercely left and right, eyes never meeting. They have no idea what they are doing. They know exactly what must be done. When the women hear shots and screams from the neighboring village, they know husbands and sons will soon be home for supper. The thrill of marching is imprinted from birth as an infant's external genitalia crest on the vulva's horizon. The rhythmic clapping and stomping begins. It's a boy, joyful noise of an all-night celebration will muffle the whine and whoosh of another Icarus falling. And another poem from this section, but under the subsection, or I should say under the evil and others, but the subsection being reinvention of the truth of gender. Boy and her theory. Auto transformer trollop goat, my fiancé, mon frère, they cooed. The bright idea has taken the shape of a whale of a hand. Whose legacy this is, no one can know. In all bright colored notes I hear, I see horrific images unaccompanied by screams. Where the hell's the theory to explain such things? Let's go, let's go. Let us go, then, you and we and they, to destroy that sly old phrasebook. Let's go, says an insurgent terrorist enemy combatant with an exquisitely just smile. I'm ending with music of alterity. The whirring sound comes gently toward this empty space. little flock of treatise parakeets, canticles of otherness streaming forth. No sweeter strangeness have I known. Clear song repairs their brains. Thank you.
Forrest is up next.
So I was going to read a couple poems that key in on ecology in Joan's new book, though ecology, as she just noted, is connected in her work to other things, including patriarchy and gender, religion, time. The long and short of it, thought experiment. Feed long and short-beaked pigeons the same food. Exercise long and short-legged quadrupeds in the same manner. Expose long and short-haired sheep to the same climate. Direct every timeline toward the same set of nesting horizons. How long can the we and the they go on this way? One step takes longer than anyone thought possible and is still hovering in the air. Its shadow is swelling with prophecy and indecision. Earth is growing hotter and colder, wetter and drier. All the animals are on the move. Although the heart of cruelty continues to elude our metrics, let any long or short lifespan equal exactly the same function of X divided by the violence of 0. You'll notice that the math is adding up to an old geometry of the tragic spectrum. More the terror, less the pity. Is that the long and short of it? And then I'm going to read Anthropocenes, Anthropocenes spelled with S-C-E-N-E-S, not just C-E-N-E. And I get excited about everything in Joan's work, but the sonic semiotics in this, the sounding of, the murmur diphthongs in the first line, the or, the r, the off rhymes, the ripple, able, nipple, the sounds of im, in, n, m, n, close together. The long O's, no, won't, go. The short on, bake on, non, pan. And towards the end, the sequence of mean, meant, men in dimension, mon in demonstration, and mean again, before these cool twos that end this poem. So this is Anthropocenes, Anthropocenides. A storm is slanted toward the trailer park. No immigrant ripple, pith inescapable. The class of all thoughts that can't entertain themselves, upend would-be transcendence lurking here. Shine, Bacna, beacon. No ship won't go down in that Gesamtkunst stormy sea. Bacon sizzles on the non-stick pan. What is mean or meant? In this, who cares to know? One dimension grinds noisily past another in a routine demonstration. Proper response? Enjoy the friction, avoid collision. Beautiful silver fish jumps out of water and explodes in air. Transnipple, Q. Will some of us never be post-data? These long days, nights are too mean, too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry for too many on this planet. And then I'll read a couple poems that I like to think are in, I'll read a little sequence of short poems that are, that I feel are in dialogue with Joan's poems from a manuscript called Twice Alive. Thinking about lichen. Twice Alive. Microbiont just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life and a contested mutuality. Twice alive. Algal cells swaddled in clusters. You take a 3-lens jeweler's loupe to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichens, then the rock tripe lichens, then the Amanita Buddha mushroom, cambric in color, swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony in drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum, and the wet phallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume, persistent on your skin when I touch your throat, so slow to evaporate the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. So evening finds us at this wood's edge where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air ghostly and damp clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes, softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention unlinked to our own. And let's pass this on to Mónica de la Torre.
Hello, everyone, again. I'm really grateful to be here in this space with Fred, Forrest, Tracy, Joan, the Poetry Project, and you, viewers of the future. I just want to say that I find Bosch such an incredible book. I learn from it constantly, and I find it to be unbelievably responsive to so many of the situations that we're going through right now. That's one of the things that I admire about it. It's responsive, it's marriage of political commitments, formal experimentation, indirection, and its humor just continue to inspire me. So it was hard to pick poems to read because I love all of them. And if you're seeing this, please go buy the book right now. I guarantee you will feel the same way as I do. And with that, I will begin with a poem in the Math and Sci section. And the poem is called Rational Numbers Peace Initiative. It's a poem in a couple of sections. 1, argument. Strong versus weak, needy versus well-off can be seen as a matter of morally charged percentages. That all percentages are rational numbers and rationality is essential to peace may be a significant factor in calculating solutions to problems of resentment and unrest. A distribution of percentages deemed fair among human integers, parentheses, let each human equal 1 integer, end of parentheses, that are in turn deemed of equal value is essential to enduring peace. It has been found that if rational numbers form a saturated quotient field in an ideal ring of real number integers, the overall sense of an acceptable realism is increased. Belief in political realism is essential to peace. Hence, the math must be entirely persuasive. 2, foregone conclusion. Another way to put this is to know that any integer x may derive self-confidence from its identity as a prestigious rational number. Let the total number of public health units scheduled for shipment to foreign countries be determined by a destitution index at least 90% greater than our own. That percentage is prima facie a rational number that, derived mathematically in an abundance of predictive caution with margins for annual adjustments, anticipating unforeseen upheavals and catastrophes, indicates our own program of rigorous simulation training in the cultivation of transnational empathy will effectively prepare as much as 75% of all global citizens to go about their daily business calmly and productively, whether in chaos of war or chaos of peace. Moral: the more arbitrary the plan, the more precise it must be. Note: some information on the previous page was accessed at funtrivia.com, an insecure site. So I'm going to ping pong from Joan's to my book. My book is called Repetition 19, and I have a poem in one of the sections that deals with the etymologies of numbers and some strange mathematical conversion here or equation. Error is boundless. We tried using tally marks instead for seeming more discreet. While adding them up, one of us kept texting the other one of us, sending photos of bright green cakes with rings of pink icing on their edges and trios of blue flowers adorning their tops. Single-digit price tags sticking out from toothpicks as if for birthdays pre-1999. Soon it got challenging to keep count while referring to each number as a number that is one more than the previous number indefinitely. A lemon yellow cake appeared on screen and it became evident progression would only lead back to the beginning. One is a version of unus, oinos. In other words, listen to us. Two mirrors tu and also. When a single unit is no longer the case, one becomes reciprocal, a second person. At the end of you and me, three becomes expected, except when misread. Trie or trio, gender dependent. God a prisoner or king, laughing away. What to make of thief and fief, of oil lamps, especially as in quinques and pent up. I skipped 4, quater, squatter, since 4 is for all when being walled off. Timestamp 4 p.m. I meant not to demonstrate, but to delve into the full expression of the form, yet it kept emptying out, becoming non-tiered. I will now read another poem in Joan Bosch'd called Transmigration. And I will only read you a fragment of the poem, which has 13 sections. It is a translation experiment, and this is how Joan describes it in the book. Time, an investigative poem, was embedded in the mass migration effort of 2015-16, when Germany was a dream destination. Equipped with smart device, Time traveled border to border, language to language via Google Translate with tens of thousands of Syrian and Afghan refugees. So Time, before I read the first section, traveled through Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, Serbia, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and then was recovered back into English. Number 1, time in English. Time was when what time was what time is time, what it was or is it, what time is it, when one sweaty noun baking in the sun on a Mediterranean island, and now several poetic gestures along with a few good philosophical questions emerge, all about the same time, round about the same thing. The poem in Turkish, which is one of the poems I was able to transfer onto Google Translate, sounds like this.
Turkish zaman ne zaman oldu ne zaman oldu zaman öyleydi ya da birkaç iyi felsefe sorular ile birlikte bir Akdeniz adasında güneşin terli isim pişirme ve şimdi birkaç şiirsel hareketler hakkında. Ortaya ne zaman ne zaman ne zaman oldu aynı şekilde aynı zaman yuvarlak.
Thank you, Siri, for delivering that. I will read you the Spanish version of the poem. Tiempo. Cuando es hora de algo bueno, cocinar nombre de filosofía, sudado en el sol. En la isla mediterránea, de preguntas y ahora algunos movimiento poético, cuando tenía la misma forma al mismo tiempo. And I will now read you the last version, English recovered from final translation. When it's time to cook something good, name of philosophy, sweated under the sun, put on the Mediterranean island and now some poetic movement, if I, in the same way, at the same time. In my book, there is a section of 25 translations of one poem that I wrote back in the 90s. The poem was in Spanish and it was called Equivalencias, to be precise. And I'm going to read you one of the translations where my poem actually wasn't successful and it wasn't really able to be carried across the, so to speak, language barrier in the form I wanted it to appear, because the conceit for this translation was for it to not include any words of Anglo-Saxon origin. Those words were banned from the poem. The poem could only include certified English, according to some translators who ban Latinates from translations because they sound too foreign. So this translation is called A Big Beautiful Wall. 1, no din, a flash, a sip of a hot drink made from roasted and ground seeds found bitter after swallowing. A bottomless pit. Twofold roads, one path, and shut eyes unawake. 2 looking glasses are how many? With dusk come lights. 2 children, now 3. 3 is oath, is stillness, a chum, a foe. 3 truths, 3 lies. 4 times the speaker said nothing. 4 and 2 are the same. Having asked 5 times why she'd stay there, she set the bed on fire and left, letting it burn. And I'm going to end with one of the misogyny variations, patriarchal pastiche, in Joan's book. And it begins with a quote by Walter Benjamin. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the whore called Once Upon a Time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast open the continuum of history. The great intellectual patriarch must be no less man enough man among man enough men. He from whom all generic male pronouns, all great male nouns, all great greatness have for millennia been spawned in service of the great continuum of the great history of the greatest natural languages throughout linguistic time, that he is the he of whom Gertrude Stein wrote, they were outstanding in coining words without women. The patriarchs cannot escape history, nor can history escape them. They are caught because they have won the right to be and meaning. Where the shadow of the patriarch falls, the agency of the others may relax and withdraw. I mean, she said, was not said of women. Just as the great intellectual, the great spiritual patriarch must, by the logic of the praxis of paternity, embrace misogyny while reviling the word itself. The colonel has directed his soldiers to grow nasturtiums. Meanwhile, once upon a time, one of many she's responsible for these salient observations danced all night with her beautiful dog, danced right out of the patriarchal figure, family romance, right into a welcoming ambiguous figure. With that, I will end and hand it over to the great Fred Moten.
Thanks, Mónica. I'm really happy to be here with you and Forrest, my fellow students and sub-nerds under Joan's protection and influence. I want to read also from In Loco Scientia. I want to read a poem called The Truth of Physics in so many words. 1. Thanks to the second law of thermodynamics, any assemblage of particles will eventually scatter into the most random and useless configurations unimaginable. Material poiesis of these words notwithstanding. Unfortunately, for long-term planning purposes, long-term unimaginables will always elude preferences for short-term grasp. No matter that short-term imaginables reliably send us astray. Imagining the unimaginable is a rarely consummated paradox, the whole in the transformation poets and physicists seek. 2. Thought experiment 2. Suppose you could, AI unaided, fast forward your synesthetic imagination to absorb with visceral immediacy fates over time these words will meet, far beyond the allure of classical fragments. Starkly fey letters compose these worlds, their geometries of attention, microgeometries, subatomic choreographies of electrons, photons, gluons, neutrinos, Higgs bosons stirring excitation in primordial Higgs fields, where it is true no birds sing, no sweet clover ever sprouted messages to glorify these disappearing words. 3. Drought combusted flames lick the ass of paradise. Do you find this an embarrassingly erotic image? For stalwart elites teetering on a few remaining pinnacles, excitation is key. Come on, folks, as history's detritus morphs into ash, let us recall great eras of romantic portent as they and we slough off to sea. Screens gone blank kissed virtual reality bye-bye so long ago. The truth of physics may return us only to what we cannot create or destroy. Despite once and future magic in these words, earth, air, fire, water, the pre-Socratic era is conclusively revised. We have slogged through the same damn stream a shitload of times, more than twice. 4. On our way to another reckoning, we women will stop in on one Greek tragedy or another where we've always felt most at home. We'll rend garments, smear mud and ash on our faces, tear out hair, run bald, naked, bellowing stubborn love through the streets, giddy to escape another labyrinth of rhetorical illusion where every alphabet has been ravished beyond belief. Puzzling interlude. Is the alphabet a fable and every letter a moral? Or is every letter a fable, the alphabet the moral? So I wanted to read 2 poems of mine, one from a book called The Service Porch, and the other from a book that I co-wrote with a friend named Wu Sang. And that poem is called Denise's Poetics of Physical Sociology. And the reason I wanted to read these poems is because I've always fantasized being in the same room with Joan Retallack and Denise Ferreira da Silva at the same time. And I don't know if that'll ever happen, I hope so. But in lieu of that, and under the power of Zoom, at least they can be here together right now through me reading this poem. Part of the reason that I always wanted to get Joan and Denise together is because Wu, Denise, and I are part of a experimental band called the Institute for Physical Sociology. And in particular, Denise's work as a theorist and student of the history of the war on Blackness and the history of the war on subsistence does all this magic with the word poethical in ways that are, of course, reminiscent of the magic that Joan does with that word too. So I'm just going to read these two poems together without marking the difference between them. They're basically the same poem. The beauty of physics manifests in a set of problems and paradoxes, not as an impossible dream of purity, is inseparable from the blackness of physics. Ether, the cosmological constant, hidden variables, they're all indicative of a certain strain. Blackness and beauty are given in and as an irreducibility of the blemish, this motley ass both-andedness that keep on getting down and handed down. Hawking radiation, entropic and undeniable temperature, open, secretive disappearances of information is like a mirror image of Hopkins' non-locality. Retrograde Standard tried to enact its revenge on cryptographic remix in a thought experiment predicated on the impossibility of an isolated singularity. But physical ethereality, which so emphatically ain't no thing, be steady chanting black is beautiful. The blackness and beauty of physics be pied. Inscape be constantly escaping. The changes be past change. Ether be neither noir, neither here nor there. Ain't no thing, ain't nothing but a party. Denise's Poetics of Physical Sociology is another name for y'all's oceanic building. Dawn's black and blur mattering and gather, Brenda's russet mantle of scattered mothering, Anne's fly shaker mixology and modest fruit, all y'all's low-pitched clavic gravity and grave accentual bloom, graven, a vellum miraculously 3 and 4D familiarity, indented and abandoned in its selflessness. Presence ruptures here and now, folds it in its arms to vapor so we can breathe the novelistic air we dance through. All this barbecue on the one hand, and the burnt ends of all that beautiful burnt orange wine on the other hand, is the history of radiance in pendergrass and toasted rosemary. When, since we all up in here, rub us down in fire, cylinder, Melinda, and salted bone. So here's Tracy Grinnell.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Mónica and Forrest. I'm going to start actually with notes from the Sappho Colloquium, which begins with an epigraph from Joan Retallack. Would Sappho be so beloved if she were a whole woman, more than a puzzle of scattered fragments? And I'll just read the first section from this poem. 1. There is absolutely no external evidence for convivial gatherings of Athenian women. Exactly which fragments were fished out of crocodile mummies? This one seems entropically excised from a choral composition. In accordance with that ancient precedent, be gracious and help me. In accordance with your countless oars, a strong wind blows them in the right direction. You just can't pin down a Pindar. She doesn't have to rub it in again. An accomplished poet can always manage to change the subject. Nobody is prepared for 6 interconnected infinitives leading to a prayer. The actual praying is usually done by an officiant. The demon must be the accusative subject. The gods that inhabit her poetry are gods who do nothing other than being gods. Here's a little punchline for an unnamed demon. She was, after all, singing. And just to double back on the truth of physics that Fred read, the last section, on our way to another reckoning, we women will stop in on one Greek tragedy or another where we've always felt most at home. We'll rend garments, smear mud and ash on our faces, tear out hair, run bald naked, bellowing stubborn love through the streets, giddy to escape another labyrinth of rhetorical illusion, where every alphabet has been ravished beyond belief. And on my way to another reckoning a few years ago, I wrote a sequence called Humoresque that is something of a meditation on Sappho's leap, or standing at the promontory, or mid-leap from the Leucadian cliff, based somewhat or related somewhat to a Gustave Moreau painting of her mid-leap, and begins with a epigraph from the Euripides, the Trojan Women. Cassandra says, "I know that I am mad, but mother, dearest, now for this one time I do not rave." And I'll just say it's this poem, even though it's a few years, this poem sequence, even though it's a few years old, is sort of immediately came to mind to read in relation to Joan's work. It's very, it's a loose transliteration of the Sapphic form, and so that constraint has really guided the exploration of sort of what is an impossible position to imagine. Only an ear to the sea confided, error swallowed whole in reflection, dream leaves, genuflecting lovers return the one who feeds the horizon. I, my only city, erratic violence. I, my only compass is into the night, like transfigured ocean, so seriously operatic. I, waves seem seamless, water of memory comes, nearer not alliteration, serves night, dead, ringers, delight, favoring muses, rapture, battling, sirens. Sea to sea remembers, succumbing to sea, lights horizon song, undone, lyre unmasked, far, depths, Ladonia's canyon in darkened straits, while, as if there, as if, more so silent falling, lacuna like lapse, calling, where my body unmooring, false hole, nor my carriage go, nor my wayward vessel, nor listen to gulls. Foreign skin, I, bedded in waxwood, root-like, tearing holdfasts, finger-long fishlets, caw-caw at my eardrums, drowning, unable, I list all that I look on. Rebellious bird of uncommon waters, I am what is bested, the beast and all, by violins, the lyre, or whatever cursed love fixes in triumph. Overhead, the listing embodied, blind touch, black ocean, figures solve nothing, every house falls, eventually perpetual motion, wild light, seaworthy, false knell. Terror of bodies swelling the ocean's blank stare, comely night, catastrophes bidding for each, hawking failures of fantasy, ghosts of restless, slaughtering tongues wail. Empty terrain proffering expiration, baited promontories, reflection, echoes, acres of sirens, deviants, confounding, warlords in every dream. Captive, captor, whispering times unleashed, faceless songs of tangled instruments, tempest, prone to tidal violence, counting octaves, breathless precision. Droning, soundless, everywhere, watching, what eyes? Nothing, betrayed my dying, archaic smile that one loves best, a warrior's coma, thronging, empty, relenting. Crisis lyrics frozen, forever in arms, false reflections leaping to render fragments, whole, a promontory of gazes gone to prosopopoeia. Growing cold or fearsome, the darkness of earth offers what? A palindrome's logic, false glass, ricochet, reversal is reminiscent, pacing in cages. Gentle cushions, water of wings unfurling, only glassless while unemployed, the mirror, Mars its mirror, faceless until it's gazed on, wits gone to wander. Tonight, I think I die. In filmy advances, lucid ocean begins again, untoward figures, bird-like cants who know what it is to perish in nonsense. And to close out the reading portion of this fantastic virtual event, I'm going to go back to Bosch'd and read the last section in loco postscriptum afterwards. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of truth in language was so great there was no way to know what one had to go on as one had to go on going on. Pleasure. Pleasure comes unexpectedly. Happiness is a matter of will. Or is it the other way around? Happiness. Happiness comes unexpectedly. Pleasure is a matter of will. Or is it the other way around? Last thought balloon. I like art, he said. It's better than looking in the mirror. Thank you all. And we'll go to a puzzling interlude before we move into conversation. Okay, great. So we are back and going to jump into a conversation. So yeah, go ahead, Forrest.
So earlier, Joan was talking about the relationship between the rape of women and the rape of the environment and how those things are connected. And in her book, as in many of her books, there's a multilingual, multidisciplinary frame of reference that's worked through delivery systems of, in this book, thought experiments and translations and acts of ventriloquism and cross-historical etymologies and logical fallacies, all of which have been used historically as modes of control and power. translation as homogenization, ventriloquism as the right to speak for others, logic as dogma. But I'm particularly interested in your etymologies with gendered assumptions. But both Mónica in her recent book and Fred in his recent book share a lot of these sort of projects of translation. Each of you, all three of you, use Spanish and other languages in your books. All three of you are quoting others or writing with others. And in Fred's case, sometimes big lists of others. And all three of you are using, are critical of translation techniques that are, that don't account for equivalencias. But all three of you use etymologies in a way, I wonder if it's a different way, a less problematized way. And if you see there being a problem about using etymologies as a kind of anchoring word to an origin or source truth.
Well, I think there would be a problem if you believed that you could actually find, first of all, the real origins, the origins as they were part of lived languages in earlier times in the magnificent OED, but which I consider extraordinary and love, but I don't count on the some sort of ultimate truth in that. I mean, those very spotty usages. I do love the usages because there's certainly not going to be a misapprehension about this having been the only way the word was used at the time, and they tend to span amusing forms of life and kinds of sources. But I think that it is really important to notice how words were used and understood to the extent that we can historically, while never thinking of that as conclusive evidence about anything. But the textures of the words over time, the way the vowels and the consonants and so on slide around and the spellings, all of that I absolutely love. And I love that in Chaucer, for instance, not only in etymological dictionaries, but where in the same poem a word is spelled in different ways and has different resonances because of that. That could be and probably is often chance. Because spelling simply wasn't standardized until relatively recently. But I mean, for me, it's absolute fun to read etymologies. And I do always note for my students that fun is the important middle vowel in the word profundity. So you can have faux profundity while having fun. But I'm eager to hear what others have to say about that. Or I should say, and I'm eager to hear.
I guess I mean, same. I find it really fun to go back to the source in order, at least this is what I do with some of the poems in repetition 19, is go back to the source to kind of undo the authority that the authoritative source conveys on certain words. So that's part of the riff. And also just like mishearing, misunderstanding it, refracting it. Refraction is really important to this book. This idea that if you approach, if you approach one of these etymologies deliberately with the intention of misunderstanding it through a different language, then automatically, like the sign itself is neutral, right? The properties of the sign, be it the visual properties of it or the sonic properties, will bring associations to the sign that are not part of the official definition of the word. And that is what I find tremendously generative when it comes to refraction and approaching the sign through Spanish or other media that I can use at my disposal. Yeah. So that's what's at play there. Yeah, and it was fun to, I mean, the pronouns blow my mind, the etymologies of the pronouns. It was fun to think of numbers too, because we think of numbers as being dissociated from semantics, as existing on their own, but even numbers, the names for numbers have histories and legacies. And then I'm also thinking of Joan's beautiful way of putting those past participle, present perfecting legacies, and how that also is embodied in words, right? In just the histories of certain terms, or all of them. And that's also, it's a different project in a way, but a project that also brings so that playfulness into the mix and helps order.
Present participling has such a sinuously sinister scent to sizz a bit. But, you know, thinking about legacies that are, I mean, just doing exactly that. They are past perfected, present participling, instantiated in the habitus, as Bourdieu would put it, that carries on things that we are transmitting ourselves to new generations, often unconsciously.
Well, I think a book like Bosch is a kind of it's like a kind of big, huge complex of wormholes, you know, like some kind of cosmological, you know, terminal that you can go to for various forms of travel, and often, you know, the words are the doorways, you know, that you go through in order to get on whatever ship you're trying to get onto to get. And of course, you don't know where you're going to go, but it's going to be someplace interesting, and it's not really ever going to be back to anything like an original source. I mean, and you know, etymology works that way. I always like how, you know, with most of the words that I look up, I mean, one of my favorite things in the world is the etymology online. I just go there all the time to look up words, and you know, it's not a heavy duty, you know, hyper scholarly etymological dictionary that sometimes you can go to those too, and those are really fun and serious too. But even with the one online, I like how, you know, as they try to trace it back as far as they go, it usually ends up in some Proto-Indo-European indeterminacy, you know. It's like not a dead end, but the search peters out, you know, the search for the source you end up in a kind of muddy swamp kind of thing, you know, and you just can't quite locate it. You know, there's someplace further back you could go, but you just don't quite have a way to get there. And I, you know, I feel like Bosch is always, even the title, you know, is so great because there's Bosch, the painter, obviously, and, you know, the etymology of that word is weird because it eventually goes back, I think, to some Dutch word, or one of the traces is to some Dutch word, bosch, that means forest. But there's for some weird reason that I don't understand, there's a connection between the Dutch and the Catalan, you know? They both end up somehow around forest, you know? Not that forest, but the other forest, but that forest too, you know? And but then I kept thinking about Juan Bosch, you know, who was the first democratically elected president of the Dominican Republic and who was deposed after a year by Johnson, you know, and the sort of brutalities of American foreign policy. And then I take the C out and think of Bosch as just nonsense, you know? And I think, what's the relationship between Bosch, the painter, and Bosch, the word that means nonsense, and Bosch, the politician who was conceived of by normative politics as nonsensical enough to have been cooed out of existence, you know, with, you know, so I feel like there's just all this beautiful, unlined, unbordered stuff going on, you know.
Including botched, of course.
Yeah.
We botched our language and our ecology.
Yeah.
Well, it's making me think of, I mean, paradox, sort of, you go far enough back in any etymology and you find an opposite or a contradictory meaning potentially of any word. And in relation, I'm curious to hear you talk about that, Joan, and Forrest, or whoever else, about that relation to paradox, and that's so active in this work philosophically and actually. So I think that those connections, that sort of legacy tracing back, you are going to hit that paradox at some point. So.
The paradox, say a little more about the paradox part.
Well, I'm using that very broadly. I think that just the idea of paradox, I mean, it's something that paradox, your book begins with, you know, gravitas and humor, and, you know, this kind of play of opposites against each other or contradictions that is so activated in your work. And I'm just wondering, you know, connecting that to Bosch, to the title, to the painter, to you're thinking about that.
I'm thinking, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I do. I mean, this takes it to a cruder logic, but I enjoy juxtapositions, and I enjoy them because they are fun to notice, but also because they are what complexity means in our world, in a sense that that we should be enjoying the fact that we find ourselves in situations, say, with others who are very different from us, or, I mean, you know, on every level, there is this entanglement of that is nature, and something like gravitas and humor, for me, is, I mean, to think about the fact that they need each other, that we need them together, mm-hmm. in order to in some way reflect the the marvelous complexities of being alive on this planet with others, is also a matter of asserting that the official logic that one who studies philosophy, as I did, for instance, learns that that contradictories can't be, or would be, or just imagined contradictories cannot be part of the same logic, is just ripe for we poets to dash, if not bosh. I mean, it's so I don't. I'd love to know more about the sense of there being a kind of it sounds like an increase in what are seem to be initially incompatible things as you go back in history. I haven't thought about that in that way. Working with etymologies, but a lot of the Oxford and Cambridge language philosophers were really counting on finding the truth at the end of a search in the OED. And when I was studying philosophy in the department that I was in, there would be the professors were going up and down the hall with the shorter OED tucked under their in their arms. I mean, they wouldn't go anywhere without it. So, but that's different from Heidegger, who's making up. I mean, who's adding to the toxic mythology that was so much of the Third Reich was based on, and so on.
Can I just say, this is an aside, but I cannot not mention it. This computer is propped on
The
volume
short
2 of the OED. I wish I could show you. I can't, because otherwise, yeah, I mean, yeah, no.
Okay, you can't. You don't want to just. Well, I'll show you something.
There is some at my dining room table, and oh,
I'm sitting right next to a lower shelf that has the entire previous version of the OED on it, which I've had for decades.
that is really funny. I pulled out mine because I needed to find a word for a Portuguese translation, going back to Coimbra. There's all these serendipitous circuits and connections. I was translating a Portuguese writer, Anna Hatherby, incredible, and she uses a word that from Camões, and it's all about returning to the source. So she goes back to As Lusíadas in Camões and writes this poem, and I needed to find something similar that was that was simultaneous with the term that Camões used originally. And I pulled out the OED and it came in really handy right now for this. Yes. And I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else, but it'll come back to me.
Well, Fred's about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, Heidegger's political and moral intentions are what I would call, sort of ordinarily reprehensible, I'm sorry that everybody, not y'all, I'm saying, but, look, I mean, I would call them slightly worse than average than everyone else in the history of philosophy. I mean, I think it's important to put him in his proper place, which is not extraordinary, His brutality and viciousness was relatively commonplace within the history of that train of thought. So, and I'm not defending him. I mean, it's brutal and monstrous. It's regular though, I mean, I don't think he's not particularly worse as a thinker than Thomas Jefferson. You know, just got a bit worse reputation for whatever reason. You know, maybe because he's newer, okay, or maybe because, well, it doesn't matter. The thing is, though, I do want to defend Heidegger's methods, you know, because his methods are poetic, you know, and to the extent that there's a defense of poetry to be made, I would defend his methods. I mean, what I like about the way he uses etymology is precisely that. I wouldn't even say he gets it wrong. He just gets it poetic. He just makes shit up, you know, and he places himself on shaky ground precisely in the interest of trying to put himself on solid ground. And there's something about taking that method from him against the grain of his intentions that's productive, it seems to me, for me, you know. I mean, look.
So you appreciate his creative etymologies.
Yeah, I mean,
he wouldn't admit to them, but yeah.
Who cares what he says? I mean, you know, Thomas Jefferson wouldn't admit to being a pedophile, but he was one, you know. So what they say about what they do is whatever, depending on what kind of work you do, it's interesting or not, but it's not interesting because it's true. What's interesting about is what they do, and whether or not, you know, given that, you know, the history of thought is a junkyard, you know, a thrift shop, what can you use? What fits depending on what you got to wear that night or where you got to go, you know? So, you know, it's like I said, he does things with words, you know, in an interesting way that I don't want to say it's just part of a history of that kind of license, which the victims of the history of philosophy have to take up, you know, as part of our toolbox, you know. So, you know.
Well, I know, Fred, that you use Heidegger in interesting ways. I've seen it on pages in your books, and I think the issue is one of usefulness, and for me, Heidegger was useful as a kind of foil. I have to admit that, because I was very much interested in and doing language philosophy, language-oriented philosophy, and how to put it? Well, I mean, I put together a whole book called How to Do Things with Words, which is long out of print. That really.
We also put together that book too. For Austin.
Yeah, Austin. So J.L. Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words, refused to see either humor or poetry as legitimate performative words that make things happen in the world. And that was very useful to me to take on as something that I wanted to argue against, but with poetry and humor, not with philosophy. Meanwhile, I use a lot of Austin's work right on, because I think it is right on. But with Heidegger, maybe when we're in that room with Denise and we could all talk about Heidegger. Heidegger has not been useful to me in the same way. And yeah, go ahead.
I would say he is abuseful.
Useful.
I try to abuse him as much as possible.
Okay.
And knowing full well that if he had the chance, he would do so to me, you know. But I was just thinking about your how to do things with words, Joan, and Austin's how to do things with words, and Tracy Morris's hoodoo with words. And we should figure out maybe how to do words with things or something. You know.
Well, that's what Joan says, create silence. Yeah. Joan, you use the word human 13 times, the word humor 9, and birds come up just next after that. I love that.
So how are you tracking that? You mean in what I just read, or
in the book? Bosch. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. You have it online, so you could trace those things. Huh. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm interested in humans, and birds.
Humor.
Yeah, human, humor, and birds.
Birds. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good moment to segue into our collaborative poem, unless there's any other points anybody wants to touch on. Thank you all so much. I will start us off. A sonorous animal moves with and within the landscape it also defines.
Held in a house you break and build and sounding.
While you consider options, I salute how quietly you defy flatness, your multi-purpose materiality.
Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes softened.
Poikilos Sappho, your fragments set virgins to celebrate all night in shredded spaces.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A pleasure.